Call on members' order of the day, number 1.
Crimes Theft by Employer Amendment Bill, third reading.
I move, Mr. Speaker.
Camilla Bellich.
I move that the Crimes Theft by Employer Amendment Bill be now read a third time. Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to be standing here being able to bring this third reading of this bill to the House. I think it's fair to say it's possible that many of us thought that we would not get there in terms of this bill being introduced in the last Parliament and now with the change of government. So I couldn't be happier to be here being able to shepherd this bill through the House. First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge a personal thing, which is it's my father's 70th birthday today. Happy birthday, Dad. And he's been a lifelong champion for justice in the workplace, so I think hopefully he'll be very happy to see, although I won't be able to spend much time with him today because I'll be in the House bringing this bill to the House. Now, this bill criminalises intentional theft by employers to their workers. And why? Why is this bill needed, Mr. Speaker? This bill is needed because of the injustice that many workers face in New Zealand to this day. And it was brought to this House by a very, very good man, a very close friend of mine, a former MP of this House, who I believe is watching tonight, who came to New Zealand as a refugee. He experienced injustice in the form of wage theft. He then became a Member of Parliament and brought this bill to the House to stop any other workers suffering what he did. So I think really that is a story of New Zealand and also of this party. So can't see where he is yet, but hopefully he's watching today. So Ibrahim, this bill is really for you. And I read when I was preparing this debate his first reading speech, and it's really a fantastic speech, Mr. Speaker. So I do really encourage anyone to read that speech rather than listen to my speech tonight. But I thought it would be pertinent to read an extract of that because it really summarises why this bill was so important to him and how important it is for so many workers in New Zealand, especially migrant workers. And so this is what he said. Not long after arriving in New Zealand, I got my first work in the Wairarapa. It was farm work with my employer shuttling me from Lower Hutt to Martinborough each day for work. At the end of my first week of work, I was told by the contractor that I'd done a poor job and it was not worth the cost of shuttling me to and from work, that I did not deserve any pay. I was told that if I had any decency, I should be paying the employer back for his costs that week and the work that I'd done amounting to nothing. I was told I would not be paid, and if I didn't like it, I should just piss off. He said, not knowing what my rights were, I just walked away from my payment for my week's work. But as I came more involved with migrant workers, I found out that my experience was not the exception. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this experience is not an exception in New Zealand, and it regularly happens in New Zealand. And unfortunately, some businesses deliberately rely on regularly underpaying their employees and have it baked into their business model. This bill imposes serious criminal sanctions in order to stop this practice. Now, we know, Mr. Speaker, that most employers are good employers. In fact, almost all employers are good employers. And so this bill really applies to the businesses who are not acting within the law. It doesn't impose any additional sanctions on employers. It essentially allows good employers to continue doing what they're doing without fear of anything happening to them. It doesn't, unlike many other employment-related laws that come to this House, impose any other conditions or work or bureaucracy or anything on employers. It just asks them to pay employees what they're owed, to pay them their fair wages, to make sure that when they contribute their labour, that they are fairly recognised for that. Mr. Speaker, taking this bill through the House, I've regularly been asked by people if we have a lot of evidence around wage theft, and I just wanted to cite a few of these different examples to really show how this is a problem in New Zealand and how I hope this bill will be able to address it. So in 2019 there was a report by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment that found that wage theft was one of the most common forms of migrant labour exploitation in New Zealand, the most common forms. We've seen examples, as this bill has gone through the House, Mr Speaker, of migrant workers working as cleaners being underpaid by $17,000, workers who've worked over 900 hours being only paid for a small percentage, being only paid for 32 hours. We've seen people who've only been paid an equivalent of $7 an hour for their work at bottle shops. We've seen cafe staff, hospitality workers and construction workers, unfortunately, deliberately underpaid by employers who were taking advantage of the fact they could. This has to stop in New Zealand. These are all New Zealand workers who deserve respect. I was very honoured once my colleague Ibrahim Omar brought this bill to the House in April 2023 to then see this bill come through the Education and Workforce Select Committee. Now we had 84% support of submitters at Select Committee, so quite a significant support from the people who were able to submit to this bill. And I was very, very pleased then to see that reported back to the House, and I think really the circuit breaker for this bill not going in the dustbin of good ideas was the fact that we were able to obtain support from parties across the House. So we're very privileged to have the support of the Green Party and of Te Pāti Māori throughout the readings on this bill, and then after Select Committee we were very, very pleased to get the support of New Zealand First to allow this bill to go through the House. And so I want to really thank the members of New Zealand First for looking to their values and seeing that many of the values that we have we share, especially when it comes to standing up for vulnerable workers, for making sure that there isn't exploitation in workplaces, and for fairness. And so I wanted to thank especially Honourable Mark Patterson and Honourable Casey Costello for their work on this bill. Their work did lead to an amendment to this bill, which I think has actually made this bill stronger. This bill now is very clearly applies to employers who deliberately steal without reasonable excuse from their employer, and that, I think, is the intention, the original intention of the bill, and really has clarified the purpose of this bill. So it's really clear, and if you look at the draft that we've got here today, I think we've improved on that bill since Select Committee as well. So I really want to thank New Zealand First and, of course, Te Pāti Māori and the Greens who have supported us throughout the process. Mr Speaker, this bill is not an unusual bill either in terms of international comparisons. We know that in Australia many states have had wage theft laws, and since the 1st of January 2025 that Australia has outlawed wage theft under its Fair Work conditions. We also know that Norway has laws against wage theft, and also California has laws against wage theft. So really this bill brings New Zealand into line with world leaders in standing up for injustice at work, and provides a real avenue for those who have faced terrible injustice with what little they have. And we have to remember, Mr Speaker, for many people, especially people that come to New Zealand, the only thing they have is, the only thing that they can use is to sell their labour in order to make money. And if the value of that is taken away by someone who professes to be an employer on purpose, then those people should be held to account for that. So I just want to reflect on why many of us would come to this House. I think we come here to stand up for justice, to hold people to account, and to protect the vulnerable. And I think this bill does all of those things. I want to again acknowledge my colleague Ibrahim Omar for bringing this bill to the House. This has been a collective effort, my friend. We wouldn't have been able to do it without you, and having the bravery of you to bring this bill to the House, and indeed many members of the Labour movement who were able to raise this as an issue and to assist. And I especially want to acknowledge, as you did in your first reading, John Ryle and Peter Cranny for their assistance with this. So, Mr Speaker, I very much hope that when we pass that we can pass this bill tonight, and that this bill will become law, and that can be something that members across the House can be proud of their Parliament standing up for the dignity of work, for justice, for fairness, and for working New Zealanders. I commend this bill to the House.
And it's a National Party call. Katie Nimmin.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Look, tonight we are speaking on the third reading of the Crimes Theft by Employer Amendment Bill. I wasn't actually fortunate enough to speak on the second reading, and so I feel like it's my opportunity to make my fulsome comment on the bill in the third reading, which is absolutely a-OK. Madam Speaker, I am the chair of the select committee that heard this bill. We went through a very rigorous process, as we always do when we go through our members' bills, and I think there's a few points that I would quite like to make. And look, I understand that it's likely that this bill will go through its third reading as it passed the second reading, and so just acknowledging the nuances and reinforcing that the very reasons that in the first reading it was already in the first reading, and the second reading we did not support this bill is for the reasons that I will outline. One of those, of course, is the impact that it makes on the criminal justice system. And of course, to acknowledge the points that we've already made and continue to make, is that there is already an Employment Relations Act that covers any dispute between an employee and an employer. The process exists, the civil court action exists, and by making it a criminal offence, obviously adding penalties, adding criminal repercussions to employers not only clogs up the justice system, as we have made that clear, but also takes down a different path, something that has otherwise had a path for resolution between the employer and the employee. And look, not to say that it's a slippery slope, but we do this for everything that we have currently civil action for, making things criminal, including and increasing penalties. What then do we have left in the Employment Relations Act and in the civil courts? One thing I will just do, going through the points, and just to acknowledge, obviously, as has Camilla Balich, the member currently shepherding this through the House, on behalf of Ibrahim Omer, and just commending his involvement in the process. So, of course, he came to Select Committee and was acknowledged through that process and his participation. And we did hear some stories from people that have had a very challenging time, and I think it's important that we acknowledge those people, obviously, whether it's migrant exploitation, whether it's worker exploitation, those are things that we absolutely don't want to see. The point that we make, and the point that was well made by Business New Zealand, is that what this does is further divide the employer and the employee in the relationship that they have in the workplace. So I think the point to make, and the point that opposition are trying to make quite loudly, is only if they steal. Well, actually, the first person that has to take this as a criminal offence to the police is the employee. And so this is not to say that in every single case what they take to the police is valid. It is then for, and members opposite have mentioned this in the first reading, the second reading, that in every case that this is taken to the police is not always going to be grounded. And so what we are doing is adding another criminal offence. We're adding another criminal offence to the justice system, further clogging up an already very lagged justice system, a criminal system that's having to deal with retail crime, gang crime, violent crime. Additionally now adding a further crime to the Crimes Act. And the point that we're making here is that in every case where an employee has been hard done by their employer, or perceives that they've been hard done by their employer, whether it's $2, $20, $200, that they have to take that to the police, they have to have the police investigate the process, and they then go through the criminal justice system if it is, in this case, and as the amendment has been added, intent to be dishonest. And look, that's something that we debated heavily through the Select Committee process. The very point, and as we mentioned in our report, that of course, actually, I'm going to come back to that point. Members opposite said tough on crime. Absolutely. And do you know what I'd rather our police be dealing with? I'd rather our police be dealing with people crashing cars into a dairy, people robbing someone's house, people wearing gang patches in public and intimidating members of the community. I would rather the police be dealing with someone being stalked, I would rather the police be dealing with just about anything other than a dispute between an employee and an employer that can be dealt with through the civil court. And this is the point that we are making. We are absolutely tough on crime. And now all we are doing is adding an additional crime for police to get involved in when there's a dispute process already in place. The next thing is that the opposition are going to be introducing crimes for dealing with tenancy disagreements. And I bet we'll see that coming. Unfortunately, they're probably already going to go there. They've probably got it drafted up, ready to go. But the point that we are making is at the end of the day, this is not...
Interjections are fine, but this is becoming a barrage from both sides. Katie Nimmin.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. This is not the point that is trying to be addressed. As we have always said, every time we work for the worker and we work for the business, we want to make that relationship closer, not for somebody to feel that they have to take that to the police to have a dispute resolved. And so this is the point that we have argued from the beginning and what we heard very loudly from Business New Zealand. Now, I just want to identify, obviously in the select committee process, we hear from all sorts of people. Now, of course, we heard from the unions, we heard from individuals that have been impacted, that have had terrible stories of how their from their workplace relationships, and that's something that's really important for us to acknowledge. But Business New Zealand in this very case has represented a lot of businesses who haven't come and spoken in their own case, because to acknowledge that the member Camilla Bellich did say almost every business and almost every employer is a good employer. But in so many cases, and there's inevitably going to happen, where police are going to be entering a workplace, pressing charges against someone or investigating someone for what has been perceived to have been done to an employee, and that has absolutely, without a doubt, going to have an impact on their reputation as an employer in the first place, whether or not this ends up being something that gets pursued or ends up going to court, or even if it goes to court, whether or not they end up winning the dispute or not. And so it's really important for us to identify those repercussions, and Business New Zealand made that very, very clear. And that's something that we can't ignore, and we didn't ignore on the government side of the Select Committee. And look, I think it's really important to make sure that in every single case we are thinking of the perverse outcome, because we are absolutely and by no means putting to the side the experience of the worker. We made that very clear, and we heard some very telling stories from people, and absolutely acknowledging the intent that the former member and now the current member have with this bill and what they intended to bring to the House. But the point that we continue to make is that the additional pressure on the criminal justice system for something that has a pathway for its dispute to be resolved through the civil courts, through the Employment Relations Act, now to have further penalties, and actually for some employers to face a year in prison. If people didn't read that in the documents, make sure that it's very, very clear that this could be over a couple of $100, that someone has the right now to take this to the police, that then that employer could face lifelong reputational damage, the inability to ever operate a business again, and face up to a year in prison. And it's not to say that there might be people out there that do something that deserves a course of action, absolutely, but to say that now people have to go through this process to be investigated, to be part of the criminal justice system, the impact that that places on them and their reputation, and the feeling that that has in the workplace for others, that is something that absolutely has a pathway to be solved and resolved through the current system. So we feel that that is a slippery slope to having a criminal approach to just about everything that we have civil action for. We've made it very clear in our Select Committee report, and I'm sure you'll hear from my colleagues throughout this evening, our position on this bill. But at the end of the day, to make something that has a current pathway through the Employment Relations Act a criminal offence is adding an extra layer of bureaucracy to a process, and it is taking away from our police and from our criminal court system from the very real crimes that this government, who is absolutely tough on crime, to be focusing on something that has already got a resolution process. And so with that, we do not commend this bill to the House.
Thank you. Now, what I omitted to say before the last speech was the question is that the motion be agreed to. Te Anō Tuiono.
The question should be agreed to, Madam Speaker. And we're hearing tonight about people being soft on crime, on tough on crime, but that side of the House is very selective on the crimes that they want to prosecute, Madam Speaker. And I mean, I do acknowledge that Katie Niman is a good chair of the Select Committee, but I cannot agree with what she has just said just before in that speech before as well. And I had hope that the National Party would be supporting this bill. You know, we expect the National Party to sort of hug the middle, but unfortunately they seem to be incredibly distracted and incredibly attached to their ACT Party mantra, Madam Speaker. So it's disappointing that once, and we expect this from the ACT Party. You know, they're the big business on hyper-capitalism. It's, you know, we know that they will do anything to burn down workers' rights. That's what they're about, and we expect that. But we also sometimes have hope. We have hope for the National Party that actually they'll see the light and try to hug the middle, but unfortunately that is not the case. They are still unfortunately subservient vassals to the ACT Party. And I was hopeful actually that the smell of burnt plastic in school lunches might have convinced them, Madam Speaker, to support this bill, but unfortunately that does not seem to be the case. Fortunately, there is a government party that does sound that they have unshackled themselves from the neoliberal freight train of capitalism and will be supporting this bill, hopefully at the end of this as well. But Madam Speaker, I do want to acknowledge Ibrahim Omar, who brought this bill to the House in this first reading. I acknowledge his presence here today as well. What a momentous occasion for him to be back in the House to see this bill hopefully be passed into law, and I feel that it will happen, Madam Speaker. And it is important, and people have spoke about it before, because I spent a bit of time tonight reading his first reading speech, where he talked about his actual experience of having his wages stolen from him. And the case that he talked about himself when he was working on a farm in Wairarapa, and then his employer telling him that they didn't like his work and just took his pay, Madam Speaker. And as the previous speakers from the Labour Party have said, and I do want to acknowledge Camilla Bellich's expert shepherding of this bill through the House, noted that there was a 2019 MB report which said that there is such significant impact on migrant workers, and that significant impact was wage theft. Wage theft, Madam Speaker. So this bill is incredibly simple. It is incredibly simple. If you nick something, you get pinged for it. If you nick something, you get pinged for it. If you're an employee, you put your fingers in the till, you're going to get pinged for it. That's what's there at the moment. But if you're an employer and you put your fingers into your employee's pocket to take their money, you don't get pinged for it. And we hear from that side of the House, Madam Speaker, well, that particular corner of the House, Madam Speaker, that particular corner of the House, that there is a pathway for workers to take, that it's the civil pathway, a civil action pathway, Madam Speaker. But if for those of us who come from families, who are migrant families, where mum and dad don't speak such good English, they're just recent immigrants in here, how are they able to access that pathway, Madam Speaker? How are they supposed to at least not only access that pathway, but afford that pathway, Madam Speaker? It is outrageous. And that's why it's so important that this House turns its mind to supporting this bill through the House, to supporting and upholding workers' rights, because it is a basic right. It is a decent right. If you do a hard day's work, you should get a fair day's pay. If you do a hard day's work, you should get a fair day's pay. And people shouldn't be allowed to hold back your wages. And that is what is at the centre of this, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I don't want to prolong this kōrero because we want to get to this bill being centred here in the House, but I was thinking of a whakatauki, and it goes, ko te amorangi ki mua, ko te hāpai o ki muri. Ko te amorangi ki mua, ko te hāpai o ki muri. And what that means is, if you've got things sorted out the front and you've got things sorted at the back, that's when things are harmonious. So when you're on the marae and people are doing things well in the kitchens, and your workers are doing well in the kitchens, and that enables people in the front to do their bits well at the front as well. And what that points to is a good relationships. We need good relationships in the workplace, and acknowledging that for many, if not most, of employers, they won't be having their fingers in the employee's back pocket. But it points to the importance of making sure that we have those good relationships. But those employers that are stealing, that are thieving from their employees, this bill goes some way to addressing that. So, Madam Speaker, on that, the Greens support this bill.
Laura McClure.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I love doing some speeches after the Green Party. Firstly, what I would like to say is ACT is not anti-worker. In fact, we are extremely pro-worker, and I understand the intent of this bill, and I want to firstly acknowledge the previous member for bringing this bill forward. I think everybody in this House can agree that if an employer intentionally withholds money, that is a very, very serious matter. None of us want to see employees exploited, and I think that is pretty huge. But there are reasons why we can't support this bill, and Katie Nimmin has very well, I would say she's articulated all the points very well, but let me remind everybody, and it's not because we don't believe in the cause, in fact we really do believe in it, but there are already key mechanisms in place. We have the Employment Relations Act, we have the Immigration Act, and we have all kinds of other little bits and pieces that you are able to do in that. And I think what might be quite useful for everybody is to actually go through what some of these actually processes are and how they actually look, or how effective it is. So, present data shows the effectiveness in the current system in resolving employment issues, including the number of enforcement actions and penalties awarded. So if we look at the 2022-2023 financial year, there was 112 direct enforcement actions that were taken, resulting in approximately 1.13 million in penalties awarded by the Employment Relations Authority. 2021-2022, 212 investigations, 685,000 in penalties awarded. 2023 to 2024, the 400 odd complaints that were, of the 400 odd complaints, most of these were resolved without enforcing penalties. The system is actually working. Why would this House want to create another layer of bureaucracy on top of what we have under the premise of keeping our workers safe? It's all great to hear all the stories, and I do believe it is really stressful. I remember one time when an employer didn't pay me, and you've got automatic payments coming out. If you're living week to week, it's extremely stressful. If you know you're not getting that money at all, that's absolutely horrible, and I don't think any of us can accept it. But we've got a system, we've got mechanisms in place. We don't want to see an employer being potentially victimised. We don't want to see our police going around and knocking on the doors of businesses when they've got actually a real crime to deal with. So, we do not support this bill, and I think it's very clear why we do not support it. Thank you very much.